So we're ready to start our roundtable on a very important issue. It's regulation of new modes of transport. Today we're living in the era of technological revolution, which gives dramatic transformation on an annual basis to global business and big industries. We are at the situation where the global cities used to exist late 20th century, when the horses were replaced by cars. But now there is a new, wider circle of different modes of transport entering our cities. This is not only surface transport, this is robotics, this is flying transport, driverless transport, and new types of movement inside city arrangement. A new obstacle, a major obstacle to all these things positively impacting is the legal framework. So now these regulations are being developed, and the speed of the readiness of the city to be open to new modes of transport. This is the result of city and federal authorities. Today we're going to talk about how generally we can regulate this movement inside the city and how to make it secure and comfortable. And we'll try to understand how it should be implemented to the best extent. To this end, we have invited the prominent and distinguished speakers. First, I would like to give the floor to Greg Litzen, the head of Mobility Direction UC's Foundation. Please take the floor.
Thank you. Apologies for speaking in English as the American on the panel. So speaking as a New Yorker and as an American particularly, we were some of the first to have ride-hailing in particular. So looking at Uber and Lyft, and of course Yandex and others, and Grab and Didi, and these disruptive mobility services. And cities tried to regulate them. They tried to work them within their existing taxi frameworks. They argued that they were separate from them and resisted attempts at regulation. And in a handful of instances, Austin, Texas, for example, where they did pass a referendum on safety, forcing them to comply with those regulations, Uber said, forget it, we're leaving. And during that time, innovation reigned in Austin, new services launched. But eventually what happened is that these companies realized in the United States context, they could go to the state legislatures, which were run by Republicans versus more democratic cities, and they could use sort of political turf battles to obtain what they wanted. So therefore, they wrote their own regulation, and they got the state houses to pass it. And Uber, I singled them out, Uber is seen as a technology company. In fact, Uber has as many lawyers and lobbyists working for the company as it does engineers. It's particularly successful at being able to rewrite local regulations to sort of suit its own business ends. And that's what it's done in state after state. That's the history now. What's more interesting is that in a handful of instances, cities have begun to fight back. And doing so, rather than trying to pass laws, they're writing their own code. So I work very closely with the city of Los Angeles, where their Department of Transportation has launched its own data standard for controlling scooters, bicycles, and eventually ride-hailing and autonomous vehicles. It's called the Mobility Data Specification. They wrote code for it. They put it on the popular code repository GitHub and invited engineers to work on it. And this standard, which allows them to basically not only receive but push data to these various devices, allows them to basically take legal regulation and do it in the form of software. And so therefore they can collect location data. They know if these devices are charged. They know if they're available. They understand their locations. And it's become very successful. Los Angeles is using it. It's spread to more than several dozen US cities, I think 15, 20 cities, and is now spreading to cities around the world. And what's interesting is that the city of LA, because it's a government body and should not control software standards, has now created its own foundation as of last week called the Open Mobility Foundation. So much like open source software started with some hackers who then created a foundation and used open source software, we're now seeing cities use open source principles to create their own sort of code form of regulation. And I think that's really interesting because number one, we've never seen governments innovate quite this way, right? Standards are usually set by business and technology consortiums or nonprofits, not governments. And second, this realization that given the pace of disruption, governments will have to basically regulate through the form of software, regular updates through software, being able to push updates down to their various the entities they're regulating. And as a second point of this, and then I'll pass it along. The other way we're going to have to regulate these types of mobility devices is going to have to be through congestion pricing or decongestion pricing, which is also evolving rapidly. London, Stockholm, Singapore, they use cameras. They famously created zones. We now have the technology, and particularly in autonomous vehicles, to use vehicle-to-vehicle technology, vehicle-to-infrastructure, GPS. We're going to be able to dynamically price our streets. I work with a software called a startup named ClearRoad that uses its technology to basically price per kilometer out on some of the highways of the United States. And they imagine that we could have our city streets where one lane is reserved for bicycles, and that lane is free. One lane is for autonomous vehicles. It's priced accordingly. One is for buses or other high occupancy. And rather than have just one charge or no charge in cities, we're going to have the ability to dynamically reallocate street space during the day, which could be transformative for them in terms of how we can move traffic in various directions at rush hour, but also reclaim streets for people. So those two areas, these kinds of new standards and new types of congestion pricing, I think are some of the beginnings of the experiments we're starting to see. Thank you.
Есть очень много таких и организационных, и культурных.
We have a lot of organizational and cultural aspects which are in the way of the new types of the mobility. For instance, in case, like traffic rules are the same in most of the countries, and they can also be applicable to robots. But however, as for bicycles and kick scooters, there are a lot of differences. In older days, it used to be like a child's game, but today they have become a main of transportation in many places. So I don't know. In my personal case, I have to ride a bicycle even more often than to use my private car or a motorbike. And my question is to Alexander Khodakov, the first deputy head of Moscow Traffic Organization Center. How the regulations will control or regulate those new types of robots, bikes, bike lane, and so on? Well, sadly, the prospects are that we are not will not develop a local code for every district or area of the city. So, but we have a federal legislation. So, but as kick scooters, speedways are rapidly developing, as well as other modes of transportation, we don't fall directly into any category according to the traffic regulations. Like bicycles with three wheels, which are actuated by a muscular force. And we have a problem that in April and May, which is the beginning of the active season for using that type of transports.
It's pity that mostly kids are suffering from these accidents. Out of these 32 accidents, 25 kids suffered. This is not quite conventional mode of transport for the city, and the drivers haven't got used to that. Therefore, we're actively working on the amendments to the traffic regulations in order to stipulate it as a separate mode of transport, kick scooter and other light vehicles, limiting by some characteristics, since the current e-kick scooters allow to move at the speed up to 70 km per hour, which is, from my perspective, cannot exist. So this is the vehicle which cannot be managed properly, and within this traffic flow won't allow the drivers of a car or the driver of this vehicle to make a right decision. So we stipulate amendments to the administrative code of behavior and the responsibility of the drivers of these vehicles. So far, it has been at the stage of discussion. So the amendments of like that to the code is a very long time-consuming procedure in the traffic regulations. We have some kind of room for that. So with the department responsible for the traffic control, that can be executed very fast, but it's a little bit more difficult and time-consuming to put these amendments to the code. So far, I cannot give you the exact timing when it is going to be possible. Thank you very much. I do hope that the amendment and development of the regulation system is going to be in line with the culture of driving, since you were right to mention that it depends not on the rules stipulated, but on those which are not stipulated in the code of how the drivers should behave. I remember, like in Moscow, there was a new trend to let the pedestrians move, even if they do not follow the traffic light. And if you go from Moscow to St. Petersburg, the cultural capital of Russia, and if you start moving like in Moscow, you are not safe and secure anymore. So this cultural driver really impacts the situation. This is the question of advancing regulation system, which is very important when you don't have the cultural or any other examples of that. Now there are some special robotics cars, and there is a lack of international practice of how to do that. So, for example, when the car sharing emerged, the regulations in Moscow were based on those in Milano. But where can we take the example in terms of the robotics? This is a big question I would ask Mr. Neznamov, who is the head of the research center, problems connected with regulation, robotics, and artificial intelligence. So thank you. Please take the floor. Dear colleagues, good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the floor. I'm going to tell you about the trends in regulations, what should be done with these cars, whether they're dangerous. Look at the screen. Do you see the picture? This is the image of the most dangerous and unpleasant regulation, not only in car traffic, but in the humanity. The red flag regulation, which was adopted in the mid-19th century, the cars emerged, nobody knew what to do. There was saying that it should be a person with a red flag. You know what happened to the car industry in England? It was in a standstill situation for 40 years. I'm going to tell you about the trends of regulation, but first I would like to give you some terms. How we call them different: Autobots, robotics, driverless cars. But over the last 4 years, there has been a very active global work on both on regulation and on the terms. I'm not going to reiterate all different levels of automation. I can just say that at the backbone, even in the UN, there is a standard, International Association of Car Engineers, which has the German standard as a backbone inside, which separates different automized car, zero level, where there is no automation at all, and the last fifth category, ADAS, when there is a driver's car in place. You just push the button. So what are the terms used? Automated driving and highly or fully automated. We don't have Autobot as a term right now. So what is happening with the regulation system? I'm going to demonstrate you two major trends. The first, which is happening in the level of UN, and the second trend, which is happening at the level of the states. In the UN, they have a resolution of integration of such cars. This is a resolution addressed to the countries, participants of the Vienna Convention. So it was developed for 2.5 years. The burden was exact and precise. So the resolution is quite simple. Security, safety, security, safety. Everybody understands that any accident is going to kill the development of the industry. Remember the situation with the Uber, when everybody started to talk about the Tesla development stop. So the resolution is aimed at forcing the state to provide security and safety of these developments, to have a testing procedure, and to make it possible to follow who drove the car at a particular period of time. At the national level, the regulation is developing quite actively. Unfortunately, Russia, see this red line? This is a rating, one of the leading consulting agencies. The rating assessed the readiness of the country to adopt this trend. We have the 23rd out of 2024 spots, even based on the criteria of readiness to adopt. What is the obstacle? The point is that over 2-3 last years, in all the countries close to us, in all the leading countries, there have been adopted the law aimed at testing this transport. The Vienna Convention is more or less general. The traffic regulations are similar. So in all the jurisdictions, that was a problem, how to allow driverless cars on just highways and roads inside the cities. So there is a law which would allow testing of these driverless cars under the control in specific areas, under the license, with the necessary security system, and but the testing procedures should be in place, as without that, you cannot have them on the road fully operating. In different countries, according to my estimate, 30 countries have such a regulation, and there are some amendments to the Vienna Convention. But what is happening in Russia? Till November last year, we had no regulation at all. Therefore, the testing of the highly automated transport was in a gray zone. In November, we adopted a special order by the government which allows testing of some types of cars in some regions on some conditions. This is a very peculiar regulation. This is the legal experiment for 3 years. It can be tested in Moscow and Tatarstan region. If you want to test a car, you check it with special authority saying that the car is safe. You go to the Ministry of Interior Affairs and the huge number of documents, verification stage, inspection stage. Look at the safety and the security. Such cars should have a special CCTV camera. There should be black box to understand what is happening inside. It should have a special red button and the special sign of autonomous car on the back. So
what's wrong about that? I would like to highlight two problems. So, according to the regulation, we can test just two types. So, we need an engineer on a board who will interfere if anything would go wrong. And this is bad, because in Russia, we have some developments where initially the car only has like a red button. So, you see Matryoshka Volga bus on the top and Nami's project. Secondly, we cannot legally place an engineer on the passenger seat, although all our developments allow for this. And secondly, where to test? On the left you have Tatarstan, and on the right you have Moscow. Have a look at some pictures in Sochi, in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, and in my native city, Yekaterinburg. So if you would train a car how to drive in Moscow, where you have lanes and proper marking, what would it do on tough roads? So, and we would like this experiment to go on a wider scale. And recently, 5 more regions were added, but this is not enough. And secondly, I would like to tell you about the draft law which was submitted to the Duma last month. It is dedicated to the problem I mentioned. So we need a federal backbone legal framework to test all innovation vehicles that doesn't account for human beings inside. So nobody would want to allow a KAMAZ truck, a driverless KAMAZ truck, into the Moscow downtown. But we need a legal framework, and we are lagging behind by 3 to 4 years from all leading countries. And our developers will really leave the country. So this is the case where the legislators can encourage developing innovations. And I hope this draft law will pass through the hearing, because all players, all stakeholders in the industry support it, and representatives of the state realize its importance. Dear colleagues, thanks for your attention. Thank you. Thank you for this story, and which is very clear and visible. And what's important in your contribution, that it's not enough to write the draft law, but you need to understand how it will interact with the real subject of law. Because the question is, you know, if with a traditional car, you know that a human is legally responsible, but with a robomobile, who is responsible and who will pay out damages in case of a claim. And there is a big discussion, so maybe at a certain point in time, robot will be a subject of law with not just responsibility but also rights. But this is a futuristic story. But even today, if a robomobile will take part in a traffic accident, who will be responsible? A programmer or the company which maintain the road and doesn't provide an adequate lighting? Okay, thanks for this example for a person with the red flag. We remember that it wasn't England, the United Kingdom, which was the leader. And we remember the example of the China, which was the country which started to develop legislation in terms of the driverless car, encouraging other countries to move forward. So cities and countries which dare to experiment, I think that they take this good role of a pioneer and allow all others to move forward fast. And we know that an experiment started in Moscow, that the first driverless cars by Yandex are already on the road. So we would like Igor Alexeyev to update us on the status of the project. What are the plans? What are the prospects, in the opinion of Yandex, to unveiling driverless cars in Moscow? Thank you. Thank you. It's a big pleasure to speak after Andrei, who actually covered the complete picture of the current state of regulations and law in Russia. And I like the first slide, which indicates that if you don't do anything right now, then we will likely import than export technologies, although our companies have all necessary developments. As for our company, our plans are vast. We are testing the technology from 2017, and our plan is to grow our fleet up to 100 vehicles or more. And the question is whether we can enhance and accelerate the procedure of testing our cousin NAMI, the supervisory authority. If we would like to take one step back, so the process of entering new legislation is also that it is one step behind. Unless you start to use a technology, especially a technology based on artificial intelligence, in a certain place, only then you can understand which aspects are to be regulated legally. Quite often we have attempts to put a ban on everything, which is not correct. And I can mention like Europe and GDPR as an act, which was a limitation on developing the local IT market. And the result is that we don't have powerful IT players in Europe. And if you look into the case of the United States and China in terms of IT companies and regulations in this area, so it's well balanced in both countries, which allows companies to become leaders in the global markets. If we talk about the driverless cars in the United States of America and China, why I'm talking about these two countries? Because the three countries, the United States of America, China and Russia, has all necessary technology to develop driverless cars. So what's the current situation in the United States of America, where we tested our Yandex driverless vehicle in Las Vegas? So you get a permit to use your car on the public roads in just 1 week's time. You send an application, then you get a license by post, and you get a license plate. And of course, you can also move the passenger to the driver's seat. What is the outcome? At the moment, in the United States of America, you have 80 companies testing their driverless car technologies, and the fleet of driverless cars is about 1,500 cars. As for China, in China the main company which develops driverless technologies is Baidu, a competitor of Google. So their fleet on the road is about 300 cars. And I would like to pay an emphasis on the need to have transparent, clear, and very simple rules for using public roads. Because every delay leads to a situation that we start to lag behind, and I think that the country which is likely to win the race should not only need technologies, competencies, and expertise, but also conditions for testing without any barriers in its own territory. Thank you. Okay, thank you. And I fully share your point. If you will pull down, the others are likely to win the race. And we have a good case, modern Great Britain, not the UK, which lost the race for technological progress in the past. So today's UK, they try just to develop all rules related to innovations first. So, for instance, China tries to experiment without legislations, and UK tries to regulate innovations first. So it was the case with the genome. So yesterday, the UK registered some electric accumulators first. So we shouldn't act like China, although this might be the case. But if we would like to regulate, we should act as quickly as the United Kingdom. We have one more speaker, Ralph Peter Schaefer, Vice President of Traffic Travel Information in TomTom. So the floor is yours. We will talk about different types of mobility and regulation applied to them.
Thank you, спасибо. Yeah, I want to make a few statements of the big transformation we are ahead, and it was already covered by the previous speakers. But what is happening in cities today, it's a common goal to fight congestion. And the first thing is to understand traffic demand, and what cities try to do is managing the modal split between different means of transport, the road, but also promote other means of transport, transit, e-scooters were mentioned, and autonomous cars coming along. So in here is a challenge, but also a big opportunity we can when we move forward. And I want to bring a few examples also here in the discussion, what technology can bring, but also where some regulation is required. I'm not a big fan of many regulations, but some regulations is certainly helpful. Can I have the next slide? So also, same as Yandex, TomTom is working on technology for autonomous driving. Two days ago, I drove with an autonomous taxi in Kazan from Yandex, and technology is coming. And this is an opportunity to make the road safer, but also with the shared economy and shared services to somehow contribute to the congestion reduction and make the road safer. Technology is evolving very fast. It will take certainly some time. We're heading towards hybrid mode, and here's some disruption happening that's with the ownership, which was already mentioned. And ownership means there's different liability, and it also means the whole insurance markets will be disrupted, and there needs some regulation who is responsible for accidents, and this has a point of regulation for cities, and it was already mentioned. So however, the autonomous driving is also a huge opportunity. I will reflect later about this. It will disrupt also the whole way how we can manage traffic in the future, and there are huge opportunities. Can I have the next slide? So we see modal split management. What cities, beside autonomous driving, heading for is what else I can offer to remove cars from the road. And it means when you look to Moscow, in particular, or to other cities, we need to bring space back to the people, and means making more space for other means of transport, pedestrian zones, bikes, e-scooter, but in a way that is really safe operated. What we often see when these new things happening, introduction of e-scooters or bike lanes are done, that's still a lot of accidents happening, and technology can here help as well. If you have a blind mirror warning system, which is common standard, to make it a law, to put it on the vehicles, and then you can avoid accidents. But it's also to make space separately available for bikes and for pedestrians, to really separate the road transportation from the bike. For people on the car, it will be painful, but there's no other way around. And if you want to win the congestion fight, the only way to win this is put more room for alternatives in transit and in bikes or e-scooters where it makes sense. And this is a job also for city planners to plan for and make certain steps and regulate these things. Another point is very important that you open your. We are in Rufen also. Many cities open their data sets. It's open data for infrastructure, for traffic lights, for any kind of data source are shared openly. And it's a good step to support the industry, to make scalable products, to support mobility as a service, access to multimodal information in a seamless manner that we also can promote non-road traffic and compare road travel time against other means of, and make alternatives visible and transparent. Here's an example from Switzerland where really the focus is transit. Buses, trams and trains have priority against road, and this is a way how to stimulate, reduce the load on the road and balance out the ecosystem in a good modal split. And that is good for cities and good for the people when they have one hand side alternatives options, but also benefit from a multimodal access system. And here will also we will see much more things happening. Open data is key because otherwise the industry can't produce scalable products, and this is happening in all parts of the world. In Europe, in North America, open data is king. Another point I want to make and come in the same direction as the colleague from New York is saying, the connected car, and we're moving now from connected people and cars to connected robots. And it has a massive disruption on the way we manage traffic. So we can take this as an opportunity to move fully away from infrastructure. You don't need any more infrastructure to sense traffic. The sensor is the car of the future. It's a moving inductive loop. You have demand on the fly. You can build a dynamic tolling system, not only static. You can build a dynamic tolling system and makes the load more expensive if the demand is high. And this is in the same statement as the colleague from New York made. There's a huge opportunity to go from static taxation to dynamic market of routes. So what we see in the taxi business, if there is high demand, the price goes up, you create a market, and you can control as a city your demand of traffic with a dynamic taxation or dynamic tolling system. And this is a good thing towards with other things already happening, parking management. You have to make the space as expenses that you balance out against all means of transport and build an ecosystem where people have space to live, to walk, and not only a big parking lot for cars, which is many cities today happening still, and there is change coming for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Спасибо. Ну, в целом мы сегодня посмотрели на достаточно широкую панораму.
On the whole, we've seen the panorama on the city mobility. Let me add several aspects. My name is Evgeny Kuznetsov. I am in charge of the venture foundation, Obita Capital Partners, and we invest in this kind of technological companies on disruption technologies and in innovative development. So besides the issues specified here, drones regulation is of paramount importance. So the drones and potential robotic taxis, drone taxis, which will link the city center with airports. So the future expectation is starting to be reality. So flying taxi projects will be launched in Paris and in other cities. I hope that Moscow will also be among them. But the traffic should be right. The regulation and the requirement to the noise of electromobiles is discussed in Europe. Not that they are too noisy, on the contrary. They are too noiseless. You remember once I was crossing the street, I couldn't hear the cars, and I was about to get into an accident. So what we specify is changing the rules, the flows, and the mere nature of the transport. If we have transport in air, that will be completely new types of devices and completely new rules. So we've mentioned today, especially important that the city does not react but be rather proactive. So prior to some consumption order and is ready, we need to react before. It's easier to get the other way, but if we do it, then we lose leadership. There are a lot of potentials for drones. We can use them to deliver medicine for a person who doesn't feel well, but the use of drones in the cities is prohibited. So the companies which are first to create the logistics cities for drones are certainly the American companies. Google, they have experimental pilot plans in Australia, and Russia loses all the chance to compete here. So being proactive, we need to have the legal support for that. This is the end of our discussion of today. I would like to thank the listeners and the speakers. Thank you so much once again. I would like to wish all of us that our technological environment develops rapidly and only for the benefit of all of us.